This video was filmed in the late 90s from the onboard camera of a Swedish police car. It shows the police vehicle tailing a black sedan resembling a first-generation Opel Omega. But instead of pulling over, the Omega's driver floors the accelerator and, within seconds, disappears over the horizon. The police officers, pushing their Saab 9-3 past 200 kilometers an hour, simply couldn't keep up with the black sedan. The reason? The car they were desperately trying to catch wasn't just any Opel. In different countries, it was known as the Vauxhall Lotus Carlton, the Opel Lotus Omega, or more commonly, simply the Lotus Omega. This machine was a nightmare not only for the police, but also for most supercars of the early 90s. It was nearly banned in the UK and in Germany. Having a racing license was highly recommended to purchase one. Back in the 90s, this car was a frequent star of crime reports in its homeland, Britain, where it was sold as the Lotus Carlton. According to a popular urban legend, one of these Lotus, with robbers inside, even managed to escape from a police helicopter. And you'll learn all about this in today's video. The story of the Lotus Omega began in 1986 when the giant General Motors Corporation acquired the small but proud British company, Lotus. Bob Eaton, who was leading GM's European division at the time, was a big fan of Lotus himself and knew that the company had brilliant engineers who could make a brick fly. The idea of simply slapping a Lotus badge on an Opel and calling it a special sports version was rejected from the start. A car bearing the proud Lotus name had to be something special. It had to be the best in its class. That meant the Opel would need a serious transformation. This is how discussions began about a joint project, ideally based on one of Opel's existing models, as Opel was GM's main brand in Europe at the time. Initially, Lotus wanted to create an ultra-fast version of the luxury sedan Opel Senator, but Peter Stevens, who was Lotus's chief designer at the time, rightly pointed out that its design looked too heavy. The lighter and simpler Opel Kadett was rejected by GM executives due to its age, as it was already set to be replaced by the upcoming Opel Astra. The car that satisfied everyone was the newly introduced Opel Omega. The first-generation Omega was released in 1986 and was as far from sports performance or true luxury as it could be. It was a large, rear-wheel drive family car with an understated design. Perhaps it lacked a bit of character to compete with the BMW 5 Series or the Mercedes E-Class, but overall, it was a well-designed car. And the European Car of the Year title, awarded to the Omega by the press in 1987, confirms that. General Motors gave Lotus engineers a year and a half to transform the car in an extremely short technical brief. Make it faster. And trust me, they did. However, the Lotus engineers interpreted the task in their own way. Instead of creating a fast yet comfortable sedan in the spirit of the BMW M5 or Mercedes 500e, they built a car essentially for themselves, a supercar with a wild character, tricky to handle, which just happened to have 4 doors and a large trunk. The Omega could hit 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in just 5 seconds, which didn't just make it faster than all of its direct rivals. It put this big, 4-door brick on par with purebred supercars like the Ferrari Testarossa. But the real magic happened in the sprint to 200 kilometers an hour. Officially, it took 17.3 seconds, though that number's clearly understated. Most tests of the Omega show that with proper gear shifts, it reaches 200 kilometers an hour in under 16 seconds. That was faster than the Porsche 911 Turbo and even the BMW M5 E39, which wouldn't appear until a whole 8 years after the Omega. In a test conducted by the British magazine Autocar, which included acceleration to 100 miles per hour followed by an immediate stop, the Lotus Omega was beaten by only one car, the Ferrari F40. But these numbers came at a price. This car hated driving slowly. In traffic, it would start to overheat, and if you wanted to drive the Lotus Omega every day, you'd need to train your left leg, because the clutch pedal in this car was incredibly heavy. The official top speed of the Lotus Omega was 282 kilometers an hour, a figure recorded at the Nardo test track. This number was especially significant because the top speed of its main rivals, fast German sedans, was electronically limited to 250 kilometers an hour. But this record-breaking speed brought the Omega not only fame, but also a whole lot of trouble, including legal issues. Despite the complete understanding between Lotus and General Motors, the fate of the car was not as straightforward as it might seem at first glance. The first conflicts arose when it became clear that Lotus wouldn't have full creative freedom over the car's design. Apart from certain details, such as the wheels and final aerodynamic refinements, the exterior body kit was designed by GM's European Design Center, led by Wayne Cherry. This center was based in Rüsselsheim, Germany, the same city where Opel's headquarters were located. At one point, two different body kit designs for the future Lotus Omega were developed and tested simultaneously, one in England and another in Germany. Ultimately, the German version was chosen as the final design, much to the disappointment of the Lotus designers. The final result was a compromise, but even so, the car looked absolutely stunning. When the first prototype was unveiled at the 1989 Geneva Motor Show, the reaction from both the press and visitors was overwhelmingly enthusiastic. At that point, General Motors had no more doubts. The Super Omega had to go into production as soon as possible. The first thing that gives away the Lotus Omega as a super sedan is its color. The car was painted in just one shade, Imperial Green, most likely a nod to the iconic British racing green. At first glance, it might have looked like a regular Opel, but in reality, it was easy to distinguish thanks to the Lotus badges and the unique body kit. But since communication between Lotus and Opel was rather patchy, for a long time the companies weren't sure who and how would manufacture all this beauty. In Britain, they wanted unpainted car bodies and only the necessary parts delivered straight from the Opel factory, whereas in German Rüsselsheim, they were unwilling to retool their production for a small English project. There were even suggestions to set up production using the German tuning workshop Irmscher, which, among other things, was preparing the Omega for DTM races. In the end, however, everything ended up with the option that was the most inconvenient for Lotus. Lotus received standard, production line Opel Omega 3000s in the required color from Germany. Then, all the unnecessary parts, including the engine, transmission, and seats, were removed from the cars and sent back to Germany, while the remaining components underwent modifications. Only the roof, hood, body paint, air conditioner, radio, some of the wiring, and the factory toolkit remained untouched. The most important modifications, of course, were made under the hood. The displacement of the standard 3-liter inline-6 was increased to 3.6 liters. They then set about adding enhanced pistons, crankshaft, connecting rods, intake, and exhaust. And if that wasn't enough, they also decided to add some more spice with a pair of Garrett turbochargers for good measure. As a result, the car produced 377 horsepower. By the standards of the early 90s, that was a very serious figure, especially considering that the aforementioned Ferrari Testarossa had 385 horsepower. Initially, at the time of the Lotus Omega's development, General Motors didn't have a transmission capable of handling this insane torque. In the end, however, a solution was found. They used a transmission developed by the German company CF specifically for the 4th-generation Chevrolet Corvette ZR1. The transmission was far from the only part borrowed from other General Motors vehicles. The rear differential, for example, was taken from the Holton Commodore, which was produced in Australia. Early road tests revealed serious problems. Due to the huge torque and the peculiarities of Opel's rear multi-link suspension, the car behaved erratically, suddenly losing traction in an unsettling way. As a result, Lotus had to retune the entire suspension and even order special tires from Goodyear, whose secret compound was used exclusively for the Omega. The Lotus Omega turned out to be an insanely fast car, but it wasn't for everyone. A heavy, powerful machine with no electronic aids besides ABS, it was extremely demanding and challenging to drive, especially for inexperienced drivers. It required a certain level of skill to fully unleash its potential. By the way, those who picked up the car during the initial pre-orders were offered a complimentary driving course to master its handling. But despite all its power and uniqueness, the Lotus Omega became embroiled in criminal stories. The British press, renowned for its penchant for blowing scandals out of proportion, even suggested completely banning the sale of the car. On the other hand, the Omega itself provided ample reasons for such measures. For a long time, as the fastest four-door sedan, it was especially popular among criminals, who frequently stole it and used it to commit robberies. The fact was that the police at the time simply didn't have vehicles fast enough to catch an Omega, which earned it a particularly notorious reputation in the United Kingdom. The most notorious criminal story involved an English car with the license plate 40RA. On November 26, 1993, this Lotus Carlton, how the Omega was known in Britain, was stolen from a house in the West Midlands. Over the next few months, a gang of criminals used the Lotus to ram their way into stores at night. In doing so, they managed to steal alcohol and cigarettes worth a total of £20,000. Police never caught up with the ram raiders as they simply couldn't keep up with the supercar. Even the police force themselves pretty much admitted defeat, with West Midlands PC David Oliver expressing, "We simply haven't been able to get near the thing, and it looks unlikely that we ever will." And that sounded about right, considering that the fastest vehicle the police had at the time was the Vauxhall, also known as the Opel Senator 3.0, which could only accelerate to 240 kilometers an hour, while the Omega, mind you, could reach 282 kilometers an hour. Legend has it that one day, while cruising along Britain's M6 motorway, the Omega even managed to lose a police helicopter. Unfortunately, no recordings confirming the car's escape from the helicopter can be found today. However, the measures to restrict sales of this car ultimately led nowhere, simply because the Lotus Omega wasn't exactly selling well to begin with. As accidents, including those in Germany, became more frequent and cars ended up crashing, an unofficial restriction was introduced. When someone visited an Opel dealer to purchase this vehicle, they were asked if they held a racing license. If not, the person was put at the end of the queue, told that all the cars were reserved, and most often, they ended up not getting the car at all. Out of the planned 1,100 vehicles, only 950 were produced, and by 1992, production had simply been halted. In the end, the Lotus Omega emerged as a living legend, a super sedan that combined blistering performance with uncompromising character. It never became the everyday fast sedan many had hoped for, but instead carved out a niche as an exotic weekend weapon, a car for those with a passion for driving. Today, with only a limited number of low-mileage, meticulously maintained examples still on the road, the Omega's achieved modern classic status, captivating enthusiasts and collectors alike with its daring spirit and unforgettable legacy.